Excellencies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. It is my pleasure to welcome to the podium to Ms. Daniela Kravetz, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. Before I give you the floor to the mandate holder, I would like to remind you that the list of speakers will be closed in 15 minutes. Now I give the floor to Mrs. Daniela Kravetz to present her report. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to address the Human Rights Council this morning and present my first annual report on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. Before turning to my report, I would like to make some brief remarks about the current situation in the country. It has been a year since the signing of the joint declaration of peace and friendship between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Since July 2018, the two countries have continued to strengthen their efforts to promote regional peace and security. Eritrea has also worked towards improving its relations with its other neighbors. Additionally, Eritrea has begun normalizing its bilateral relations with various countries beyond the Horn of Africa region. Despite these positive developments, there has been no tangible improvement in the situation of human rights in the country. The dividends of peace are not yet benefiting ordinary Eritreans, nor are there any signs to suggest they will. As a result, hundreds continue to flee the country every month. Since finalizing my report, I have received troubling news about developments in Eritrea. In May, I received reports of arrest of Christians at different locations in and around Asmara at prayer gatherings. And in late June, there were reports of further arrest of Christians, including women and children, at Faith Missions Church in Keren. In mid-June, security forces reportedly arrested 5 Orthodox priests from Debrecen Monastery. Also in mid-June, the authorities seized all health facilities managed by the Catholic Church in the country, many of which had existed since the 1990s and provided health services to remote rural communities. Based on updated information, 21 health services and clinics and health centers were affected by this measure. Many were located in religious houses, and in some instances, security forces arrived, intimidated the staff, and ordered patients to vacate the facilities. The authorities have defended this measure by stating that a 1995 regulation banned religious institutions from carrying out development activities. However, the authorities' decision to enforce this 1995 regulation came only weeks after the Catholic Church in Eritrea called on the authorities to adopt a comprehensive plan of truth and reconciliation, promote dialogue, and implement reforms to prevent further mass departures from the country. On a separate note, I also wish to mention the death in custody of Said Mohamed, a young Muslim man in his 30s who died on 13th June due to mistreatment in prison and lack of proper medical attention. He was arrested together with others in March 2018 during the funeral of Haji Musa Mohamed Noor, the chairman of Al-Daiya Islamic School in Asmara. The arrests that took place during Haji Musa's funeral have already been reported in the past, and I note that other members of this Muslim community remain in custody up to date. These regrettable developments are examples of the restrictions imposed on religious communities in Eritrea, and they show that the Eritrean authorities remain unwilling to tolerate any expression of dissent. Turning to my report, last year, in its resolution 3815, this Council invited the Special Rapporteur to develop benchmarks for progress in improving the human rights situation in Eritrea. After extensive consultations during the course of my mandate, I set out 5 benchmarks and related indicators in my report. These benchmarks represent minimum human rights standards required to address the human rights concerns identified in my report. And they are aimed at assisting the government in developing its human rights agenda. Since I continue to have no access to the country, I have been unable to discuss these benchmarks with the authorities in Asmara. Benchmark 1 concerns the need to strengthen the rule of law and justice and law enforcement institutions. I remain deeply concerned about the continued use of the practices of indefinite and arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance in Eritrea, and by the lack of basic due process rights for detainees. Several cases are summarized in my report. One example is that of Siham Ali Abdul, a dual Eritrean-American national who was arrested when she was only 15 years old as she tried to flee the country without an exit visa in December 2012. This past April, she turned 22. Siham remains in custody and her whereabouts are not known. A more recent case of arbitrary arrest is that of Berhane Abrehe, the former finance minister, and his wife, Almas Haftemarian, who are 74 and 60 years old respectively. Both have been in custody since last year, and family visits are not allowed in either case. The Eritrean authorities have given no indication that they will release those arbitrarily and unlawfully detained. Benchmark 2 concerns the need to reform the national or military service. As I have explained in detail in my report, the national service remains one of the main drivers of migration from Eritrea. As I have done so in my report, I urge the Eritrean authorities to seek both technical and financial assistance from international donors to put in place a multi-year plan to reform the national service, to progressively demobilize conscripts, and to create jobs with fair and dignified working conditions for conscripts. Benchmark 3 deals with the need to guarantee basic freedoms, freedoms of religion, association and expression, and of the press. And I have already referred to this benchmark in my earlier remarks. By creating and maintaining a safe environment in which civil society, journalists, religious groups, and other actors can operate freely, the government of Eritrea will demonstrate that it's embarking on a new chapter of respect for human rights. Benchmark 4 concerns the need to address all forms of gender-based violence and promote the rights of women and gender equality. While the authorities have made some progress in this area, much work remains to tackle gender-based discrimination and violence against women, and to promote women's participation in all sectors of Eritrean society, including in leadership positions of government. Finally, Benchmark 5 addresses the need to strengthen cooperation with international and regional agencies. Various international organizations and international donors are currently seeking to enhance their technical cooperation with the government of Eritrea. However, for such cooperation to take place in an effective manner, the Eritrean authorities must lift the access and movement restrictions that are currently in place for international partners and must create an environment conducive for these organizations to carry out their mandate. Some of the benchmarks set out in my report can be implemented immediately, as the one I've just mentioned, the lifting of access and movement restrictions for international partners, and the release of those currently unlawfully and arbitrarily detained. Other issues, such as the reform to the national service, require broader consultations, technical cooperation, financial investment, and capacity building. Nevertheless, I call on the government to begin work on tackling all of these matters. I note that over the past years, the Eritrean authorities have repeatedly complained that this mandate of Special Rapporteur is politicized and confrontational. I have no political agenda. I do not wish to be confrontational. In carrying out this mandate, I have identified human rights concerns that remain unaddressed by the authorities and that have been raised in the past also by my predecessor. I have also proposed way forwards with benchmarks. I urge the authorities to work with me in addressing the substantive matters I've raised in my report. And I'm here in Geneva this week and would be more than happy to meet with the Eritrean delegation after this session. To conclude, as Special Rapporteur for Eritrea, I have met Eritreans of all walks of life. Eritreans are a proud, hard-working people, and they long to see their country thrive. But if the authorities in Asmara do not introduce reforms to guarantee basic freedoms and create space for civic participation, the exodus of Eritreans from their country will continue. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Ms. Kravetz. And as it is the practice in our discussions, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. I give you the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the last 8 years, Eritrea has sadly been the target of unwarranted resolutions and special mandates at the Human Rights Council under a trumped-up accusation of human rights crisis. The overriding objective for the special mandate was to vilify, isolate, and destabilize Eritrea and further complicate the regional peace, security, and development. Eritrea recognized that it still faces, like many other nations, challenges in consolidating a robust institutional framework and its pursuit of sustainable and equal economic growth that is anchored on the promotion of comprehensive human rights of its citizens. In this respect, it has gone beyond incorporating fundamental and universal principles of human rights in its domestic legislation, civil and penal codes, to undertake tangible measures towards ensuring equitable rights and opportunities to all segments of the population. The mainstreaming of human rights in the laws, policies, sectors and programs reflects the endeavor of the government to fulfill the aspiration of nation building and the enjoyment of dignified life to all. While we are now in this SDGs regime, it is important to recall the stellar achievements of many of the MDGs, which offer a glimpse of the progress made by Eritrea in the last 28 years, despite enormous economic and national security challenges. However, since last year, the Horn of Africa is going through rapid changes with profound implications for the future of the region and the continent. The peace dividend is the fruit of the resilience and sacrifices of the Eritrean people. At the regional level, Eritrea is working hand in hand with countries of the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea region to build trust and move forward in consolidating the peace and promoting mutually beneficial cooperation and partnership. Its engagement also extends to countries and organizations beyond the immediate neighborhoods. Seizing the emerging peace situation, Eritrea aspires to recoup lost opportunities, address the challenge, and achieve qualitative leap in a short period. The government has initiated a new development roadmap that encompasses 11 strategic areas as announced by His Excellency President Isaias Afwerki during the celebrations of the 28th anniversary of independence in May 24, 2019. The plan is geared towards building the transition for all-round development of the country. In conformity with existing practices, over the past few months, the government conducted extensive consultations with the population inside Eritrea and in the diaspora. This focused on the new era of peace, the attendant opportunities and challenges, the new roadmap for development, as well as the short-term priorities to be implemented in the 2019-2020 period. In fulfillment of the most effective mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, Eritrea has gone through the third UPR cycle, which will further provide the opportunity for Eritrea to accelerate its efforts to mainstream the promotion and protection of human rights. In this regard, Eritrea's door remains open for all those who want to genuinely engage in constructive dialogue and cooperation in the promotion and protection of human rights. This must be driven by an engagement that is dignified and a cooperation predicated on mutual respect, mutual understanding, and mutual benefit that strengthens partnership. Mr. President, contrary to the stated positive emerging situation, the present report continues to negate the ground reality and the achievement of Eritrea in the difficult situation of the last 20 years and preparation to transform the socio-economic situations to meet the aspirations of its people. It lacks objectivity and recycles much of the allegations leveled in the previous mandates. Eritrea finds it unacceptable the ill-advised justification that attempts to prepare the ground for the renewal of the mandate. There is ongoing attempt to use the new peace situation as a way of making pressure on Eritrea in the pretext of human rights, the usual pattern of behavior. Furthermore, the report attempts to dictate specific priorities and benchmarks which are at variance with the principles of non-interference in domestic affairs and sovereign rights of states. This exercise contradicts the principles that bestows the primary responsibility on states to safeguard human rights on the basis of national ownership, priorities, underlying context, and the needs of the Eritrean people. Eritrea's decision to serve as a member of the Human Rights Council is part of its desire and determination to play its fair share in advancing human rights that befits the ideals of humanity through equal, shared, and collective responsibility. It also aims to ensure...
Thank you, Your Excellency, time is up, and now, as a part of our interactive dialogue, first I want to announce the list of speakers is closed, and I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the mandate holder and to make comments on her report. Let me remind you that the speaking time limit is 2 minutes for all, 2 minutes maximum. I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The European Union thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and reaffirms its support to her mandate. The EU fully supports the peace and cooperation process between Eritrea and Ethiopia as an opportunity which could trigger the strengthening of civil rights, shared growth and development in the whole of Horn of Africa. But we also share the concern about the human rights situation, and we encourage Eritrea to improve the human rights situation of its people, to strengthen the participatory political process and to create efficient, responsive and transparent institutions. Following its election to the Human Rights Council, we reiterate our call on Eritrea to fully cooperate with UN human rights mechanisms, including with the Special Rapporteur on Eritrea, as well as with thematic special procedures mandate holders, notably by granting them full and unhindered access to the country. We welcome Eritrea's technical cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner so far, and also encourage Eritrea to further expand its engagement with international and regional actors and third countries on human rights issues. We welcome the visit in Eritrea last May of the new EU Special Representative for Human Rights, Eamon Gilmore. We call upon Eritrea to ensure and guarantee the respect for human rights and the rule of law, for land and property rights, including those of religious institutions and foreign communities, to address gender-based violence, as well as to follow up on all accepted UPR recommendations. To reform the national service, the EU stands ready to support Eritrea in the creation of new jobs and opportunities for the youth. Madam Kravetz, in your view, how could Eritrea better address the above-mentioned problems? Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia thanks the Special Rapporteur for her update on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. We support the extension of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and repeat our calls on the Eritrean government to cooperate fully with the mandate. Australia is deeply concerned by reports of severe restrictions placed on freedom of religion or belief, as well as the arbitrary arrest and detention of members of religious groups not recognised by the Eritrean government. We call on the government of Eritrea to fully respect the freedom of religion or belief of all Eritreans. Australia remains equally concerned by reports of torture and arbitrary and indefinite detention in Eritrea. We urge the Eritrean government to uphold international human rights conventions, including the Convention Against Torture, and implement the 1997 Constitution. While Australia acknowledges the efforts of the Eritrean government to address gender-based violence, we note the absence of a comprehensive domestic legal framework to address violence against women and ongoing violation of the rights of women and girls. Australia welcomes Eritrea's peace agreement with Ethiopia and continues to call for genuine dialogue, international cooperation and improved government transparency and accountability in Eritrea. We ask the Special Rapporteur what the implications of the cessation of Roman Catholic healthcare services in Eritrea might mean for communities reliant on these services. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor. With absence, so I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sudan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Sudan takes note of the report of the Special Rapporteur. One of the most important reasons for the establishment of the Council, it is to eliminate the lack of transparency, selectivity and double standards. Sudan is delivering this statement in the light of the positive development in the Horn of Africa, marked by the improvement of the diplomatic relations between the countries of the regions, which have begun normalization. Sudan commends the positive engagement of Eritrea with regional and international human rights instruments, and its presentation, the initial and combined report of the African Charter for the People and Human Rights. Sudan appreciates the cooperation of Eritrea with the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism and its submission of the second national report under the mechanism, and encourages Eritrea to continue national efforts to address the challenges it faces in the development and promotion of human rights. In this spirit, Sudan calls on Eritrea and the UN mechanism to continue their cooperation and engagement in a positive manner. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Croatia. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Croatia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the presentation of her report on the situation of the human rights in Eritrea. Croatia remains a firm supporter of her mandate. With the changes in the region and the apparent willingness of their government to normalize its bilateral relations with other countries, we, like many, were hopeful this would reflect on the domestic situation and result in political and institutional reforms in order to improve the human rights situations in the country. It is disappointing, therefore, that the human rights situation remains unchanged. Croatia commends the government for engagement with international human rights bodies and calls upon Eritrea to extend its cooperation to the Special Rapporteur. We remain concerned with the duration and operation of the National Military Service and regret that there has been no improvement, as according to the report, the National Military Service remains one of the main drivers of migration from Eritrea and an important factor leading young people to abandon school early and not complete their education. Mr. President, with the significant developments in the Horn of Africa bringing stability and peace to the region, Eritrea has a chance to make a real difference for the human rights situations of the people in the country. We urge Eritrea not to backtrack on this process. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Algeria. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Algeria welcomes the signature of the Joint Peace and Friendship Declaration between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which follows on logically from the Algiers Peace Accord. This initiative, which we encourage the countries concerned to continue to normalize through the normalization of their relationship, contributes to promoting stability and to fostering economic development in East Africa. This positive development in the sub-region will definitely have tangible consequences on the promotion of human rights, and in particular in Eritrea. Algeria is a country which encourages all peace initiatives in Africa and throughout the world, hopes that this peace dynamic will develop and will become rooted in the long term, and that with it security, development and prosperity will come to the region, because the region really needs it. My delegation encourage also the ongoing cooperation between Eritrea and international human rights bodies, particularly under Agenda Item 10 of the Human Rights Council, and also cooperation with international financial bodies in the context of bilateral agreements. We also appeal to the international community to support these encouraging developments, which will contribute to the creation of a climate of confidence and trust, and ensure that Eritrea is given all technical assistance and capacity building that it would need to fully meet its expectations. Thank you very much. I give the floor to Cuba, says the Vice President.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Cuba considers that the promotion and exploration of new avenues for cooperation of dialogue with Eritrea should be explored. Cuba is convinced that cooperation dialogue should take pride of place for human rights situations that require the attention and the support of the international community. We should, our priority should be building bridges to find solutions that embody everybody's concerns. We consider that the Universal Periodic Review, which Eritrea has just undergone, opens up possibilities for genuine human rights cooperation, and this moment should be capitalized on for us to exchange good practices and exchange concerns that exist. Cuba hopes that the steps forward taken by Eritrea to meet human rights challenges will contribute to opening up possibilities for cooperation and dialogue in the context of mutual trust, respectful exchanges, as well as transparency, which is what we need to promote true international cooperation and to make effective progress in the promotion and protection of all human rights for all. Thank you very much.
Can I give the floor to distinguished representative of Norway? You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her briefing on the human rights situation in Eritrea. We encourage Eritrea to cooperate with her. Developments and regional dynamics in the Horn of Africa are raising hopes for peace and a normalization of relations, including improvements in the human rights situation. We are encouraged by the declarations of peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia. This might impact positively on the stability and development in the region and should lay the ground for improvements of living conditions in Eritrea. As a long-standing friend of Eritrea, Norway remains concerned about the human rights situation. Upholding human rights is an integral part of any government's duties towards its citizens, and it is essential for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It is vital to ensure transparency, both on progress made on and on areas where improvements are needed. We reiterate our request to Eritrea to cooperate closely with the various UN mechanisms, including OHCHR and UN Special Procedures mandate holders, in its efforts to protect and promote human rights. Norway welcomes the government of Eritrea's readiness to engage in the human rights work, including the Universal Periodic Review, both as a member of the Human Rights Council and bilaterally. We remain committed to supporting Eritrea's efforts to fulfill its obligations. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain. You have the floor.
Gracias. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Spain supports what was said by the European Union. We are grateful to the Special Rapporteur for her work and her report. We recognize Eritrea's greater cooperation with international human rights instruments, but we consider that it is necessary for there to be better cooperation from the country, a current member of the Human Rights Council, with mandate holders of the United Nations, that is, including the Special Rapporteur, country Special Rapporteur. Spain recognizes the efforts made by Eritrea in the area of the rights of women and girls, such as the fight against FGM and early marriage, child marriage. We urge you to do more to involve women in the public life of the country, and also to do more to combat sexual and gender-based violence, and to ensure that women have greater leadership roles in public affairs. Also, it's crucial that Eritrea strengthen its institutions and its regulatory framework, beginning with the enactment of a constitution which establishes a state of law, rule of law, which guarantees protection of human rights. We are concerned that there is ongoing cases of arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances. We urge Eritrea to free conscientious objectors and people who are in prison because of their beliefs, and put an end to indefinite length military service. Also, we urge that Eritrea take advantage of the peace opportunities to make progress. We also urge you to respect freedom of association and assembly and freedom of opinion, religion, to ensure that the human rights defenders and civil society can carry out their legitimate activities freely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, distinguished representative of Spain. Now I give the floor to distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. You have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Venezuela does not support and will always oppose initiatives specifically geared towards or against developing countries, much less when these mandates do not enjoy the acceptance of the state concerned. These spaces are used as instruments against sovereign countries, and we're against this because these initiatives don't improve the human rights situation on the ground at all. The UPR has proven to be the ideal mechanism to improve cooperation on human rights. It's a dialogue between equals, and it's without politicization. In this respect, Eritrea has cooperated with the Council and its mechanism in its efforts to promote human rights of the people of Eritrea. The country has undergone 2 UPR cycles. The Community of Nations should provide support to help Eritrea to give effect to the recommendations it has accepted. Mr. Vice President, the mandates against countries violate the principles of the respect for the integrity of, sovereignty of, and of countries, and non-interference in the domestic affairs of the countries embodied in the UN Charter. They should be eradicated from our work. We reiterate once again the compelling need for this Council to fulfill its mandate to protect human rights on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation, strictly adhering to the principles of universalities, without coercion, without selectivity, without double standards, without politicization, and without these mandates against countries being imposed upon countries. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany, says the Vice President.
Madam Special Rapporteur, Germany aligns itself with the statement made on behalf of the European Union. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea for her insightful report and for engaging with the Human Rights Council in an interactive dialogue. Allow us to underline that your mandate continues to enjoy our full support. Although a positive momentum has been created in the region by the peace process between Eritrea and Ethiopia, the human rights situation in Eritrea remains a matter of concern and should thus be closely monitored. We are, amongst other things, concerned about the recent closure of Catholic health centers by government authorities and the denial of access to refugees residing in the country for UNHCR officers. we call upon the government of Eritrea to implement the necessary legal and institutional reforms in order to meet the benchmarks outlined in the Special Rapporteur's report. In this regard, we call for an end of the unlimited involuntary conscription into the national service. We also urge the government of Eritrea to free all political prisoners and to stop the continuing practice of arbitrary arrests and detentions. Germany welcomes the fact that Eritrea has engaged with the EU Special Representative for Human Rights. We encourage the government of Eritrea, a member of this Council, to fully cooperate with its special procedures. This includes also the Special Rapporteur, who should be allowed access to all parts of the country. Mrs. Kravetz, how do you evaluate the overall situation of Somali refugees in Eritrea? Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to distinguished representative of the Netherlands. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and would like to add the following remarks in our national capacity. We thank Special Rapporteur Ms. Kravetz for her report and reaffirm our full support to her mandate. The Netherlands welcomes the improved relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia and the new prospects for peace and cooperation in the region. Unfortunately, these positive developments in the region have not led to domestic reforms and the improvement of human rights in Eritrea. The human rights situation in Eritrea remains ground for serious concern. The Netherlands is particularly worried about the continued practice of indefinite national service, of allegations of arbitrary detentions, the absence of a valid constitution and rule of law, and the absence of basic freedoms such as freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. We call upon Eritrea to build on the positive momentum of improved relations and cooperation in the region to accelerate necessary domestic reforms. A positive first step forward would be to cooperate with and allow access to the Special Rapporteur and other human rights mechanisms to have an independent assessment of the human rights situation in Eritrea. Ms. Kravetz, in your view, what is the way forward in improving human rights in Eritrea and ensuring the implementation of Human Rights Council resolution on Eritrea? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I give the floor to distinguished representative of France. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. France supports what was said by the European Union. France thanks the Special Rapporteur for her oral presentation and reiterates to her its support. As underscored by the Special Rapporteur, the human rights situation in Eritrea is a cause for concern. The normalization of relationships with Ethiopia is a step forward towards the achievement of peace and development in the Horn of Africa, which France welcomes. But this normalization has no impact on the domestic human rights situation for the moment. It is time that this new regional deal give rise to concrete improvements for the Eritrean population, especially as far as human rights are concerned. Despite progress made in the area of health and education and freedom of expression, opinion, conscience and religion, the freedoms of opinion, expression, conscience and religion remain severely restricted. France is concerned by the ongoing existence of arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances. We encourage Eritrea to put an end to indefinite national service and to respect fundamental rights and freedoms of citizens, male and female. We also encourage Eritrea to continue to combat gender-based violence. France is ready to support Eritrea in that vein. Eritrea is a member of the Human Rights Council, and we invite Eritrea in that respect to cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and all of the Human Rights Council special mechanisms, especially the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights in Eritrea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I give you the floor to distinguished representative of Djibouti. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Djibouti welcomes the Special Rapporteur and thank her for her report. Djibouti hopes that our exchange today will be an opportunity for a constructive dialogue. Djibouti is making this statement against the backdrop of peace and reconciliation dynamics between the countries of the Horn of Africa region. My government welcomes the recent positive developments in our region and believes that the commitment and engagement of all countries in the region will strengthen the regional integration. The opportunities created by peace and reconciliation are far-reaching and will no doubt shall positively impact the protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms, as well as the upholding of humanitarian law of all citizens in the region. The government of Djibouti has already authorized the High Commissioner for Refugees to review all the individual cases of Eritrean prisoners of war held in Djibouti since the clashes of 2008 and to make recommendations with respect to their status and need for protection. My delegation thanks the Special Rapporteur for her update on the situation of the Djiboutian prisoners and takes note of the information concerning a letter dated May 3, 2019 from the Permanent Mission of Eritrea in Geneva. Djibouti believes that its concern regarding the fate of the Djiboutian prisoners is not seriously addressed by the above-mentioned letter and urges Eritrea to engage and to provide information on the Djiboutian prisoners' whereabouts. Djibouti remains concerned by the continued lack of information on the 13 remaining Djiboutian prisoners unaccounted for in Eritrean custody. My delegation firmly believes that the normalization of relations between Djibouti and Eritrea, if sustained by meaningful and genuine engagement, shall contribute to solve the issue related to the fate of Djiboutian prisoners of war. The OHCR, the Special Rapporteur, and the Human Rights Council are encouraged to continue engaging positively.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to distinguished representative of Denmark. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Denmark aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. I would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her report and presentation and reaffirm our support to her mandate. We have witnessed important steps toward re-engagement in Eritrea and the Horn of Africa, including the Eritrea-Ethiopia summit, the signing of the tri-party agreement between Ethiopia, Eritrea and Somalia, the Security Council vote to lift the sanction against Eritrea, as well as an increased willingness to normalize bilateral relations with various countries and international organizations. Moreover, Denmark acknowledges Eritrea's re-engagement with international human rights bodies, including the meeting between the Eritrean delegation and the Special Rapporteur in the margins of the 40th session. While acknowledging the steps toward re-engagement, Denmark notes with concern that persistent human rights violations remained unaddressed. We are especially concerned with the reports of indefinite and arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, restrictions on the freedom of association, assembly and expression, as well as the persistence of an indefinite national service. Denmark calls upon the government of Eritrea to ensure the respect for all human rights of all of its citizens. The Special Rapporteur's mandate is pivotal in this regard, and she should be granted access to Eritrea. In closing, Denmark would like to ask whether there is any sign of enhanced cooperation with international agencies. I thank you so much.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like, first of all, to welcome the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. The mission of my country examined with interest her report submitted to this session. We have taken note of her recommendations and conclusions with some reservations. Mr. Vice President, the government of my country commends Eritrea on efforts deployed to promote and protect human rights in spite of difficulties and challenges that Eritrea is faced with on the domestic and regional levels. We call on Eritrea and offer our support to continue efforts for further promotion and protection of human rights. My country supports the positive efforts made by the government of Eritrea to build security and economic cooperation to preserve peace in the Horn of Africa. Mr. Vice President, the mission of my country notes the efforts of the Special Rapporteur to achieve peace. We consider that the UPR is the optimal mechanism to review the situation of human rights in Eritrea in the framework of dialogue and mutual cooperation. Mr. Vice President, the government of my country contributed positively to bolstering stability and security in the Horn of Africa, notably through mediation efforts between Eritrea and Ethiopia. As a result, the Jeddah peace agreement was signed in September 2018, thanks to the initiative
and under the auspices of the custodian of the two holy mosques, King Salman, and in the presence of the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres. The agreement affirmed the desire of the neighboring countries to end the conflict and embark on a new path in favor of peace and stability in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to distinguished representative of Iceland. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Iceland thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and for identifying benchmarks for improving the situation of human rights in Eritrea. We welcome the continued progress made towards achieving a sustainable peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and Eritrean efforts to improve relations to neighbors in the region. We also welcome Eritrea's engagement in the UPR earlier this year and efforts to ban harmful practices such as female genital mutilation and to end child marriage. We regret that this positive momentum has not translated into much needed domestic reforms. For progress to be made, human rights must be front and center. Comprehensive reform at the domestic level are urgently needed in order to move towards a free, just, and democratic society. We also regret that during the period under review, the Special Rapporteur was not giving access to Eritrea to conduct in-country visits. While we welcome the meeting between the Special Rapporteur and the delegation of Eritrea, we urge the government of Eritrea to fully cooperate with the Special Rapporteur and to grant her access to the country. We also encourage Eritrea to sign the pledge by which new members commit to strengthening the work of the Council through good practice and by promoting a safe and enabling environment for human rights. In conclusion, we would like to ask the Special Rapporteur how women's participation in the government's current initiatives to promote regional peace and security can be increased. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to distinguished representative of Switzerland. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Switzerland thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report, and like her, Switzerland welcomes Eritrea's commitment to a number of different human rights international bodies. The presentation in January of Eritrea's third UPR, as well as its involvement at the session of the Human Rights Committee on the civil and political examples, are good examples of this good cooperation. Switzerland encouraged Eritrea to continue along that path. However, the human rights situation in Eritrea remains alarming, and concrete measures are called for Eritrea to be able to post effective progress. Reports of cases of arbitrary detentions, forced labor, as well as indefinite detention and enforced disappearances remain a cause for concern, as are testimonies of restrictions to freedom of opinion and expression, including harassment and violence against journalists. As a member of the Human Rights Council, Eritrea is called to lead by example by meeting the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights through facilitating access of international organizations to countries and through full cooperation with the Council and its mechanisms, and that includes all special rapporteurs. Switzerland encourages Eritrea also to ensure that UPR recommendations are followed up on, and reiterates its availability to continue to have a dialogue with Eritrea to improve the human rights situation in the country. Madam Special Rapporteur, a question to you. You speak of the efforts made by the Eritrean government in the area of gender-based violence and people trafficking. How can the international community support that commitment? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I give the floor to distinguished representative of China. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, China has taken note of Madame the Special Rapporteur's report and welcomes the positive changes in the Horn of Africa. We commend Eritrea for taking a constructive part in UPR and has taken note of its express opposition to the establishment by the Human Rights Council of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. Mr. Vice President, China consistently maintains that differences in human rights field should be addressed through constructive dialogue and cooperation. Eritrea has been actively engaged in promoting economic and social development, eliminating poverty, and improving conditions of the vulnerable groups such as women, children, and persons with disabilities. It has also taken initiatives to safeguard its people's right to health and education. The international community should acknowledge the efforts made by Eritrea in promoting and protecting human rights and the progress achieved. Human rights are an integral part of the overall economic and social development of a country and should be pursued and only pursued in a way that is consistent with the conditions and the needs of the people of the country concerned. China appreciates the challenges faced by Eritrea as a developing country and calls upon the international community to take a comprehensive, impartial and objective approach when it comes to the human rights in Eritrea and provide constructive help to Eritrea's human rights capacity building in line with the wishes and needs. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This brings us to the end of this meeting, and we will take a technical break and reconvene in 5 minutes to continue this interactive dialogue. I hereby declare closed the 18th meeting of the 41st session of the Human Rights Council.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I declare open the 19th meeting of the 41st session of the Human Rights Council. Before we begin our work today, I wish to remind you that the deadline for the submission of draft proposals is on Thursday, 4th of July at 1 p.m. I'm taking this opportunity to invite you to initiate draft proposals in the e-delegate platform and to table them as early as possible. We will now continue with the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. I give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We took note the update report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of the human rights in Eritrea. My delegation reiterates its principal reservation against any selectivity and politicization approach of the Human Rights Council under Item 4, particularly through the appointment of the Special Rapporteur and adoption of the country-specific resolution. Such procedure provide unjust and unwarranted tools for those who misuse of human rights for political purposes. Mr. Vice President, Eritrea has had active cooperation and engagement with international human rights bodies, including Human Rights Council. The Eritrean government also has taken positive steps in making progress towards achieving sustainable peace in the region. In this regard, we welcome signing of the joint declaration of peace and friendship between Eritrea and Ethiopia in July 2018. Mr. Vice President, in conclusion, we encourage the government to continue its efforts to implement a constitutional and a legal framework for promotion and protection of human rights and tackle some of its challenges. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Belgium should like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the presentation as well as the follow-up work on human rights in Eritrea. In light of the lack of tangible improvement in human rights in the country, Belgium believes that it's necessary to set up a close follow-up mechanism. It regrets the lack of cooperation of Eritrea with your mandate in spite of the positive dialogue undertaken with the treaty bodies and as part of the UPR. Being a member of the Council requires full commitment to cooperate with all of the instruments of this Council and not to be selective in its approach by giving preference to a single mechanism over others, such as the UPR. Belgium welcomes the political developments in the region. These are a unique opportunity for Eritrea to make headway with the internal reforms necessary in order to create more openness of the democratic space. Regional stability and human rights must go hand in hand with support for the Eritrean population so that they can benefit from the dividends of this on a daily basis. The
question of the non-limitation on the national service and restrictions of civil space, enforced disappearance, trafficking in human beings, as well as violence against women, are all concerns which require effective action from Eritrea in keeping with its international obligations. Madam Special Rapporteur, in your report you defined a roadmap to guide the action of the authorities. What are the immediate and short-term measures that could be taken by Eritrea to show their political will and the need to provide change? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and for her work over the past year. We are disappointed that the government of Eritrea, as a member of this Council, has not engaged with her mandate or that of her predecessors. We do, however, welcome Eritrea's increasing engagement with the Human Rights Council, and we encourage the government to strengthen its cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in order to achieve improvements in the human rights situation in Eritrea. Mr. Vice President, Eritrea remains a priority country for the United Kingdom's work on human rights. We renew calls for the government of Eritrea to reform the national service system, to implement the constitution, to respect freedom of religion or belief, to respect freedom of expression, and to release all those in arbitrary detention. We strongly support this Council's continued focus on these important issues. The UK agrees with the Special Rapporteur's report of 16th of May. We agree with the areas that the Special Rapporteur identifies as being unaddressed, and we urge the Eritrean government to use the benchmarks she identifies as a tool for achieving meaningful and lasting progress on human rights. Madam Special Rapporteur, how do you think that these benchmarks could be best used at an operational level, both nationally and internationally? Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Greece aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur, Mrs. Kravetz, for her report and presentation. Indeed, the positive momentum for peace and security in the region presents an important opportunity for improvements of Eritrea's human rights situation, the latter despite a few positive steps, such as the increased, though partial, engagement with the UN human rights system remains dire. Greece shares the concerns expressed in the report regarding the lack of meaningful progress in critical areas of human rights law, such as the continuing indefinite and arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances, the absence of freedom of association and press, and the persistence of an indefinite national service. We would like to stress the necessity for Eritrea to take concrete measures to ensure and guarantee the protection of land and property rights, including those of the foreign communities, diplomatic and consular missions, as well as religious institutions pursuant to international standards. Mr. Vice President, the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Eritrea, of which Mrs. Kravetz is a worthy holder, has created an important body of work. This should not be ignored, as it can be built upon in order for the Eritrean people to be the primary beneficiaries of the dividends of peace. In that regard, Greece commends Mrs. Kravetz's benchmark approach, which can provide specific measurable targets for Eritrean authorities to reach. As a member of the Human Rights Council, Eritrea must live up to its international commitments and fully cooperate with all human rights mechanisms, including special procedures, notably by granting mandate holders full and unhindered access to the country. I would like to ask Mrs. Kravetz, how can the protection of civil rights, especially land and property rights, be best combined with implementation of recommendations received by Eritrea during the 32nd session of the UPR? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Cameroon.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Cameroon affirms that peace and stability, harmony and diversity, and the responsible participation of people in the affairs of the nation remains a great asset in national development. These are all solid grounds for a country to move forward in meeting the aspiration of its people. Following the positive developments in the Horn of Africa as a result of the rapprochement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, improved relations between several countries of the region has ushered a new dynamics of peace, friendship and cooperation. The lifting of the sanctions imposed on Eritrea by the United Nations Security Council is a welcome development in this respect. Cameroon believes that the new situation will allow Eritrea to further work on improving the dignified life of its citizens through strengthening internal development and consolidation of engagements and international cooperation. Eritrea's engagement and cooperation through the UPR and treaty body reporting obligations and other similar arrangements is also contributing in the overall effort. Therefore, Cameroon calls for the non-renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and to strengthen Eritrea's cooperation through the UPR and treaty body reporting. Cameroon supports the ongoing effort aimed at consolidating regional peace, security, and promoting complementary and economic interaction in the Horn of Africa. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of Somalia took note with great interest to the presentation of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea that is established pursuant to the Human Rights Council Resolution 3224. We would like to commend and highlight the positive development regarding the improved relation between Somalia and Eritrea that will lead, as the Special Rapporteur states in our report, to a boost in regional integration and increased economic ties in the wider East Africa region. The improved economic situation will undoubtedly contribute to an increase in the enjoyment of human rights in Eritrea. Somalia believes that Eritrea is moving in the right direction as the regional engagement and dialogue have been improving in the past 2 years. A continuation on this path will allow for enhancing dialogue on human rights protection and promotion in Eritrea. In addition, we encourage the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to engage positively with Eritrea with a view of providing necessary support where relevant in the area of human rights. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Peace and security, development and human rights are the pillars of the United Nations systems and are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. Ethiopia has forward-looking strong partnership and cooperation with all countries in the region to continue to work together in maintaining peace and security, fostering economic integration as well as in strengthening efforts in the promotion and protection of human rights. The positive developments in the Horn of Africa and its positive ramifications have brought major gains in the strengthening of relations and cooperation among countries in the region, thereby enhancing their efforts towards achieving sustainable peace, security and development. Mr. President, the Peace and Cooperation Declaration that was signed in July 2018 between Ethiopia and Eritrea and the various commitments made by the countries in the Horn of Africa have further strengthened their efforts to achieve sustainable development and improved human rights situations. The dividend of this new cooperation is believed to bring further results in enhancing the efforts by the government of Eritrea in the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. Ethiopia welcomes Eritrea's engagement with the UPR mechanism of Human Rights Council and with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. First, let me thank the Special Rapporteur for her report and presentation today. Slovenia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU and would like to make additional remarks in its national capacity. While recognizing some steps in the right direction, we share the concern expressed by others, including Madam Special Rapporteur, on the broader human rights situation in Eritrea. We are of the opinion that the situation still needs the attention of this Council and therefore support the extension of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. Mr. Vice President, we call on Eritrea, as a Human Rights Council member, to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights and to cooperate with all human rights mechanisms, including HRC special procedures and treaty bodies. We would like to encourage Eritrea to demonstrate leadership and address challenges in the field of human rights, including by requesting OHCHR's support in technical assistance and capacity building. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Angola on behalf of the African Group. Angola is absent. The next speaker on the list is the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, we reiterate our position to keep the Human Rights Council as a forum of dialogue and cooperation to protect and promote human rights without discrimination around the world. The Council's discussion should be kept away from politicization, polarization, selectivity, and agendas of interference by some countries under the pretext of preserving human rights. This should be taken into account in order to preserve the Council's credibility and to keep it away from the political agendas of some countries that aim at interfering in the internal affairs of some countries in such a blatant violation of the UN Charter principles. We welcome Eritrea's cooperation with UN human rights mechanisms, namely the UPR, as an international mechanism endorsed by all member states. We reiterate that imposing politicized mechanisms on some countries and exerting pressure on them is contrary to the founding principles of the Human Rights Council. Finally, we encourage Eritrea to continue its national efforts to face all the challenges in the light of the positive developments towards preserving peace and security in the Horn of Africa, namely in light of the rapprochement between Eritrea and Ethiopia. This will definitely have a positive impact on promoting all human rights, achieving development goals, and the international community should support these efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Austria thanks the Special Rapporteur for her first report to the Human Rights Council. The joint declaration of peace and friendship between Eritrea and Ethiopia has brought a new dynamic of peace, security and development in the Horn of Africa. Yet the positive dynamic has so far not led to an improvement of the human rights situation in Eritrea. Your report documents the continuation of serious human rights violations, such as the continued practice of indefinite national service, arbitrary arrests and detention, as well as violations of freedom of expression, religion and peaceful assembly of citizens. The lack of an independent judiciary and the restrictions posed on independent civil society organizations remain major obstacles to the realization of the rule of law in the country. Deep and thorough reforms are, in our view, necessary for Eritrea to comply with international obligations regarding the promotion and protection of basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. Furthermore, the government of Eritrea should strive to improve its cooperation with UN mechanisms and explore ways in which the international community can support in implementing the Special Rapporteur's recommendations, as well as the Universal Periodic Review recommendations. Ms. Special Rapporteur, in your report you identified concrete benchmarks and indicators to achieve meaningful and lasting progress in human rights. How can we contribute to the attainment of these benchmarks? Thank you.
Thank you. We shall now turn to our list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
Mr. Vice President, Madam Special Rapporteur, we thank you for your report, which confirms what was identified by the previous mandate holder and reiterated last March by the Deputy UN High Commissioner. The human rights situation in Eritrea is dire. Regional diplomatic progress has not translated into domestic human rights progress. Violations include a broad range of attacks against Eritrean citizens' human rights and fundamental freedoms, which are committed in a climate of generalized impunity. Violations have a gross, systematic, widespread and systemic character. As a newly elected member of the Council, Eritrea has an obligation to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights and to fully cooperate with the Council. However, Eritrea has never received a visit from any special procedure. it has consistently refused to grant the Special Rapporteur access. Since Eritrea's election to the Council, the government has continued to reject expert findings and denounced reporting on Eritrea as biased or politicized. It has done so during Eritrea's third UPR on the 28th of January 2019 and through comments sent to the UN Human Rights Committee after the publication of its concluding observations last March, a highly unusual practice. Mr. Vice President, the Council should make clear that membership is not a shield from scrutiny. We urge it to adopt a resolution maintaining a high level of monitoring and public reporting on Eritrea, leveraging membership obligations and the benchmarks for progress in improving the situation of human rights, which the Special Rapporteur identified in her report as per HRC Resolution 3815. Ms. Kravetz, what strategies can the Council, OHCHR and yourself develop to follow up and ensure action on the benchmarks? Can target and indicators be developed? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the International Fellowship of Reconciliation.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The International Fellowship of Reconciliation and Human Rights Concern Eritrea thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report. Despite being a member of the Human Rights Council, nothing has changed in the government's attitude of denial and complete refusal to engage with her mandate. It has not implemented the ratified constitution or established a legal framework to protect human rights, nor has it established an independent judiciary. It has not reformed the national military service to limit its length or demobilize conscripts. It has not ended the practice of arbitrary arrest, indefinite detention and enforced disappearance, nor has it released thousands of political prisoners. Days in custody continue. It has not made possible the freedom of expression or established a free media. Arbitrary arrest or persons of their opinions and beliefs continue unabated, and many journalists remain in prison. It has not stopped the widespread abuse of freedom of religion and belief, and this is demonstrated by the recent detention of 5 monks from the Debrecen Orthodox Christian monastery and the arrest of over 200 evangelical Christians from prayers, meetings and social gatherings. Recently, the government confiscated 21 health centers run by the Catholic Church and arrested some of the managers, thereby denying thousands of much-needed primary health care service. This was a systematic and targeted move and will significantly impact the rural communities and the nation in general. The work of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Eritrea is needed more than ever. The Human Rights Council and every member state of the UN must surely recognize the vital necessity and the urgency of renewing her mandate until there is clear evidence of human rights improvements in Eritrea. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Center for Global Non-Killing.
Dear human beings, dear Eritreans, Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear webcasters, good afternoon. Eritrea is a magnificent country, beautiful people, lots of them well educated in Europe, extraordinary landscapes, ripe with natural resources and tourism opportunities. Eritrea could be blooming, firing towards development and the fulfillment of SDG 16, an inclusive society with strong institutions serving their people with care and dedication. What would it take for this to happen? First and foremost, it would require from the ruling elites a little more love for their people. As examples, there are needs to understand that religious diversity is a spiritual asset, not a threat. Or that youth is the blood, the greatest treasure of a country, its future, not a cause for exile. Now please, may these elites dwell on the humbleness needed to take the good example. Lessons learned, best practice available from other countries. In Africa, there are states who achieved major peaceful transformations. Others attained full development. Elsewhere, some disbanded their army to liberate funds for education or adopted the Gross Happiness Index. The 21st century is a time of major changes for humanity and for our planet. Change must happen, and it must happen peacefully. May Eritrea and its people be fully part of it, happily part of it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the Special Rapporteur's report and identification of benchmarks which, if implemented, could set Eritrea on a path to meaningful human rights reform. It's therefore all the more disappointing that there's been no cooperation from Eritrea, no access and no change on the ground. This echoes the assessment of the OHCHR. At the recent March session, the Deputy High Commissioner noted the actual human rights situation for the people of Eritrea has not improved in the past year. Eritreans continue to face arbitrary detention, disappearance, and violations of free expression, assembly, and religion. Individuals continue to be held incommunicado and detained indefinitely without access to legal counsel, judicial review, or family visits, some for decades. No steps have been taken to reform the open-ended national service requirement which all Eritreans are forced to undergo, often with no end in sight, and in which abuses are rife. Women and girls continue to risk sexual exploitation with little chance of redress. We had hoped that when Eritrea was elected to this council, it would seize the opportunity of a historic peace accord with Ethiopia, a new mandate holder, a benchmarks report, and international goodwill to turn the page and commit to addressing challenges. Instead, it has doubled down, continued to restrict legitimate criticism, and misrepresented its election to the Council as international endorsement of its rights record. There is little doubt it would similarly seize on any termination or weakening of the mandate as proof that nothing needs change. In the meantime, Eritreans, many of them children escaping indefinite service, will continue to flee across the border, risking serious reprisals until their government addresses the root causes that make life in the country untenable. This Council, by consensus, adopted a resolution last year that condemns in the strongest terms the systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations that have been and are being committed by the government in a climate of impunity, and asked the Special Rapporteur to identify reform benchmarks. It would make a mockery of that resolution and of this Council if scrutiny was discontinued before even one of those benchmarks had been met. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ratu. You're absent. So I give the floor to the Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. CSW welcomes the Special Rapporteur's report highlighting the ongoing and egregious violations in Eritrea. As her report illustrates, the human rights crisis persists. Peace with Ethiopia has not resulted in demobilization or any perceptible improvements. Civilians continue to flee in large numbers. Contrary to Eritrea's belligerent response to her press release on violations of the right to forb, there is no tangible evidence of a concrete situation on religion and religious harmony. For example, within a 24-hour period from the 12th to the 13th of June, authorities seized health facilities belonging to the Catholic Church and detained 5 Orthodox priests from Debrecen Monastery. Also in June, Mr. Said Mohamed became the 3rd person to die while indefinitely detained in connection with the attempted seizure of Al-Dia Islamic School in Asmara, following harsh imprisonment and delayed medical attention. On the 17th of May, 30 Christians were arrested at gatherings in 3 locations in Godaif. This followed the arrests of 141 Christians, including 14 minors, in Maitimane, Asmara, only 50 of whom have reportedly been released. The fact that these violations largely targeted religious groups that theoretically have permission to function and occurred before and during the current session of the Human Rights Council illustrates that the government's confidence in abusing the rights of its citizens flagrantly and with impunity. Eritrea is one of 22 countries that has never received any special procedure, despite requests from numerous mandate holders. With continuing violations that amount to crimes against humanity, the Council's credibility is at stake if monitoring and reporting on Eritrea's compliance with its human rights obligations is eased or dispensed with. In light of the Rapporteur's report and continuing grave violations, CSW urges the Council to ensure that the renewal of her mandate and calls on the Eritrean government to fully cooperate with UN mechanisms and facilitate full enjoyment of every human right for its citizens. Our full statement is available on the extranet. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Article 19.
Mr. Vice President, we regret that even after Eritrea becoming a Human Rights Council member state, the government continues to refuse to grant access to the UN Special Rapporteur. While there are signs of Eritrea opening to the international community, the HRC must not interpret this as a signal to reduce UN scrutiny of the human rights situation in the country. We welcome that the Special Rapporteur has set out a series of benchmarks with specific indicators that the Eritrean government should demonstrate clear progress against. At present, the Special Rapporteur's report makes clear that the situation for freedom of expression and media freedom is not improving. Persons turning 18 this year in Eritrea have never lived in the country with an independent media sector. In those last 18 years, many detained journalists are reported to have died in custody, and the well-being of many others is unknown. These detentions have been condemned by 2 ACHPR decisions, the most recent in 2016 concerning Dawit Isaac. On top of this, levels of internet access and internet speeds remain woefully low, with access to alternative news sources frustrated by government blocking of websites. Notwithstanding this closed environment, individuals have shown the bravery to speak out and to protest, and have done so at great cost. We call for full investigations into the reports that persons detained in connection with the protests in 2017 have died in custody. These circumstances make it difficult to know what is happening within Eritrea. This underscores the importance of the Special Rapporteur mandate. It provides a focal point that ensures that the plight of those within the country is not forgotten, no matter how many years pass without the situation improving. We call on this Council to renew the Special Rapporteur's mandate by consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Civicus.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Civicus, along with 8 other Africa-based organizations, welcomes the report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. And we ask the Human Rights Council as a matter of urgency to renew the mandate of this rapporteur so that the mandate can continue its vital monitoring of and reporting on the situation in the country. There remains significant and urgent human rights concern in Eritrea, and despite recent diplomatic and bilateral developments between Eritrea and Ethiopia and its ongoing dialogues with Djibouti, civic space is closed, with freedom of expression and peaceful assembly willfully subverted by the authorities. There is no independent media, and at least 16 journalists remain in detention without trial since the country's free press was shuttered 2 decades ago. As the Special Rapporteur highlighted in her report, there exists a culture of impunity for the perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses, including arbitrary and incommunicado detention. We regret that the Eritrean government refuses to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur and also with other Human Rights Council mechanisms. Eritrea has never received any other Special Rapporteur, and this lack of the bare minimum of engagement is unacceptable for a member of the Human Rights Council. The Special Rapporteur presented a number of welcome benchmarks for human rights progress in her report, and we ask her how the Council can specifically follow up on these mechanisms. If the mandate of the Special Rapporteur is not renewed, Mr. Vice President, the Council risks losing this opportunity to address in any way the grave, serious human rights abuses occurring in one of its member states. Therefore, the Council must...
Thank you. Time is up. I give the floor to Matt for Peace, Development and Human Rights Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We would like to denounce the deterioration of the human rights in Eritrea, especially the basic human rights. The government shows very slow and modest efforts in terms of reform that are not up to the realities in the country. Eritrea has a weak constitution, weak institutions, and weak entities. No independent human rights institutions are allowed to work into Eritrea. NGOs are limited into some organizations that are exclusively allowed and supported by the government with strict controls. Our organization also denounces and condemns the deterioration of the food security, as well as refraining from providing the needs of about 60 to 80% of the population. We also denounce and condemn the situation of Eritrean refugees, namely in Israel, and we call upon the Israeli authorities to stop and calling them as illegal migrants. We also condemn compulsory military service and child labor under the so-called social programs. We denounce also all the arbitrary arrests cases, and we call for the immediate release of these detainees. We also call upon protecting the Eritreans who are migrating, be it in the countries of origin or transition or destination. And we call upon the Eritrean authorities to allow the Special Rapporteur and the mandate holders to visit the country. We call upon Eritrea also to endorse the ILO Convention about the worst forms of child labor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
This was the last speaker that we could accommodate at this meeting. I now give the floor to Ms. Daniela Kravetz for her concluding remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and I thank all the speakers for your interventions and your questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to group some of the questions in my answers. First of all, on the issue of benchmarks, several interlocutors, speakers today, asked about how to operationalize the benchmarks both at the national and international level, and how can international actors contribute to the implementation of these benchmarks. A starting point for the implementation of these benchmarks in the country is a recognition by the government and a show of political will by the government that these are concrete issues that need to be addressed. That is the first step. As I have stated in my report, the benchmarks that I have set out in my report are not the only benchmarks that can be put forward. They simply represent minimum human rights standards that need to be addressed. In the same way, the indicators that are set out in the report are examples of some indicators that can contribute to implement these benchmarks. But a starting point is a recognition that these are real issues and not recycled issues, and that a willingness from the government to address them. A second step in operationalizing these benchmarks is to facilitate access and to cooperate both with international organizations such as OHCHR and the special procedures, including my own mandate, which, as I have indicated, I am more than willing to cooperate with the government, but also the government should consider cooperating with some of the regional bodies, including the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. This cooperation needs to take place in a conducive environment and in good faith. International agencies are unable to assist the government with technical assistance if the government continues to impose access and movement restrictions within the country. In relation to the short-term measures that the government can take to show political will in the implementation of the benchmarks, as I have stated today and have also pointed out in my remarks, in my report, some of these benchmarks do not require much preparation or groundwork. For example, the lifting of access and movement restrictions to UN agencies currently based in Asmara is a measure that can be taken with no preparation at all. Another measure that can be taken by the government to show political will is the release of those held arbitrarily and unlawfully detained, in particular those that I have mentioned today and have also referred to in my report, that are held for religious reasons and those held for reasons of conscience. That is a measure the government can take, and it is a measure that will go a long way in showing the commitment of the government of Eritrea in upholding its human rights commitments as a member of this Human Rights Council. On the issue of the Catholic Church and the impact that the cessation of health services by the Catholic Church will have, I wish to note that the measure that was taken this past June to seize those health centers is not the first time that we see a measure like this. In 2017, the government of Eritrea had already seized a number of health centers that were being managed by the Catholic Church. And what we have seen in the ensuing time is that those health centers have been abandoned. They have not been taken over by the authorities. So I In my view, this measure that was taken in June will have a very negative impact in the access to quality health care in the communities that were affected by this measure. And as I have noted today, these were health centers that were, for the most part, providing free services to communities in remote and rural areas. So it's a very regrettable measure by the government. In relation to the question on Somali refugees, the situation of Somali refugees currently in Eritrea is concerning. Colleagues who are in the country working with refugees are not granted access to this community, and we have seen since December 2018 that these refugees are fleeing the country, are fleeing Eritrea, and are moving on to neighboring countries, specifically to Sudan and into Ethiopia. So that is a clear sign that these refugees no longer feel welcome in Eritrea and that they no longer feel safe in the country. As for the question on women's participation in the peace process, in Eritrea's regional and efforts to promote peace and security, women have been absent from these efforts, as I have stated in my report. And I wish to note that although the government of Eritrea has allowed women to act in some leadership positions within government institutions, only women who are aligned with the government are appointed to such positions. And women in general are not allowed to organize themselves to advocate for their rights or to form or participate in grassroots organizations that are not sanctioned by the authorities. So their participation in civic life in general is restricted in this way. Yes, I think I've covered most of the issues in those remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. We have now concluded the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of the human rights in Eritrea. I wish to thank Ms. Daniela Kravetz for her presence today and all participants for their contributions.